I've been financially supporting my mother and stepfather for years, $24,000 this year alone, but they just uninvited me and my kids from Thanksgiving because we're too working class. Now I'm done being their ATM. I need to get this off my chest because I'm so angry right now that I can barely think straight and I just can't believe what happened today. For the past 6 years I've been sending my mother and her husband Richard money every single month, and it started small but it just kept growing and growing because there was always some emergency or some bill that needed to be paid right away, or Richard's business was having a slow month and they needed help with the mortgage payment. My mother would call me crying about how they were going to lose the house, or how the electricity was going to get shut off, or how they couldn't afford groceries that week, and what was I supposed to do, let my own mother starve or lose her home? The thing is that I work 2 jobs just to make ends meet for me and my 2 kids who are 8 and 10 years old, and I'm a single mother because my ex-husband decided he didn't want to be a father anymore and moved across the country 3 years ago and never sends child support even though the court ordered him to pay it. I work at a veterinary clinic during the day, which I actually love because I get to help animals and the people there are really nice to me, and then I clean office buildings at night, which is exhausting but it pays decent money, and I can bring my kids with me sometimes when they don't have school the next day and they just do their homework in one of the empty offices while I vacuum and empty trash cans. I live in a small 3-bedroom ranch house that I bought with my divorce settlement money, and it's not fancy but it's clean and safe, and my kids have their own bedrooms and a big backyard where they can play, and we have a vegetable garden that we work on together every summer. I drive a 2018 Honda Civic that I bought used, and it runs perfectly fine and gets good gas mileage, and I take care of it myself because my dad taught me basic car maintenance before he died when I was 25. My mother lives in this huge house in the fancy part of town that she bought when she married Richard 8 years ago, and it has 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms and a pool in one of those circular driveways with fancy stone pillars and an automatic gate that you need a code to get through. Richard used to own some kind of consulting business, but he sold it a few years ago, and now he just talks about all these investment opportunities he's looking into, but he never seems to actually invest in anything, and my mother doesn't work because Richard told her she didn't need to after they got married. My half-sister Emma is Richard's daughter from his first marriage, and she's 26 years old and works at some art gallery downtown, and she lives in this expensive apartment that Richard pays for, and she drives a BMW that Richard bought her for her birthday last year. Emma went to this private college that cost more than I make in 2 years, and she's always posting pictures on social media of herself at fancy restaurants and vacation spots and shopping trips where she buys clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The money I've been sending them has been getting bigger and bigger every year, and this year alone I've sent them $24,000, which is almost half of what I make from both my jobs combined, and I've been keeping track of every single payment in a spreadsheet because I'm good with numbers and I wanted to make sure I knew exactly how much I was giving them. It started with $500 here and there, but then it became $1,000 every month, and then $1,500 and then $2,000, and Richard always promised he would pay me back once his business deal started working out, but that never happened. I've been skipping meals some days just so I could send them money, and I haven't bought myself new clothes in over a year, and my kids are wearing hand-me-downs from their cousins and shopping at thrift stores for their school supplies, and I keep telling myself that it's temporary and that family takes care of family, and that my mother raised me by herself after my dad died, and she deserves to be comfortable in her old age even though she's only 58 and perfectly capable of getting a job. Last month Richard called me in a panic because their mortgage payment was late and the bank was threatening to start foreclosure proceedings, and he needed $6,700 right away, and I had to take money out of my kids' college savings account to send it to them, and I felt sick doing it, but what choice did I have when my mother was crying on the phone about how they were going to be homeless? So today my mother calls me and she sounds all nervous and weird, and she starts talking about how Emma is hosting Thanksgiving this year at their house, and how Emma has been planning this really elegant dinner party for weeks, and she's hired some fancy catering company, and she's decorated the whole house with these expensive fall decorations, and she's invited all of Richard's business associates and their families and some people from Emma's work, and it's going to be this very sophisticated affair. Then my mother starts hemming and hawing, and finally she tells me that Emma doesn't think it would be appropriate for me and my kids to come to Thanksgiving this year because we might not fit in with the other guests, and Emma is worried that we won't know how to behave at such a refined gathering, and she doesn't want anything to ruin her perfect dinner party that she's been planning for so long. I just sat there holding the phone and trying to process what I was hearing because I couldn't believe that my own mother was uninviting me and my children from Thanksgiving dinner because we weren't fancy enough for my spoiled brat half-sister and her pretentious friends. My mother kept talking and saying how Emma was concerned that my kids might not know proper table manners for such an elegant meal, and how they might get food on the expensive tablecloth or break one of the good china plates, and how the conversation was going to be very sophisticated and adult, and my kids might get bored or act up and disturb the other guests. Then she said that Emma had suggested that maybe we could come over the next day for leftovers and a casual visit, but that the actual Thanksgiving dinner was going to be too formal for children and people who weren't used to that kind of social setting, and I just lost it completely and started yelling at her about how I've been paying for that house and those fancy decorations and probably even that catering company with my own money for years, and now I'm not good enough to eat there. I told her that I've sent her $24,000 this year alone while I've been eating ramen noodles for dinner and my kids have been wearing shoes with holes in them, and now she's telling me that we're too working class to sit at her table and share a meal with her precious stepdaughter's snooty friends. My mother started crying and saying that it wasn't her decision and that Emma was just trying to make sure everything went perfectly and that she really wanted us to come the next day instead, but I was so angry that I couldn't even listen to her excuses anymore. I told her that if we're not good enough for Thanksgiving dinner, then we're not good enough to send her money every month either, and I hung up on her and immediately went online and canceled the automatic transfer that sends her $2,000 on the 15th of every month, and then I called the utility company and had them take my credit card off the account for their gas and electric bill that I've been paying for the past 3 years. Then I called the internet company and canceled their service that I've been paying for, and I called the security company and canceled their home alarm system that I've been paying for, and I went through all my bank statements and found every single recurring payment that I've been making for them, and I canceled every last one of them, and I felt this huge weight lifting off my shoulders as I did it. I know they're going to call me tomorrow and probably come over here trying to get me to change my mind, but I'm done being treated like some kind of charity case who should be grateful for whatever scraps they want to throw my way, and I'm especially done with my money being used to fund Emma's ridiculous lifestyle while she looks down on me and my kids like we're beneath her and not worthy of sitting at the same table as her and her fancy friends. The worst part is that my kids were really looking forward to Thanksgiving at Grandma's house, and they've been talking about it for weeks and asking me what kind of pie we should bring and whether cousin Emma would be there because they think she's so cool and sophisticated, and now I have to tell them that we're not invited anymore because we're not fancy enough, and I don't even know how to explain that to an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old without making them feel terrible about themselves. I've already started making plans for our own Thanksgiving dinner at home, and I'm going to make it the best Thanksgiving my kids have ever had, and we're going to invite my neighbor Mrs. Patterson, who doesn't have any family nearby, and maybe my coworker Sarah and her daughter, who are also going to be alone this year, and we're going to have a real family dinner with people who actually care about each other and not some pretentious show-off party where people get judged by how much money they have or what kind of clothes they wear. I'm just so hurt and angry and disappointed that my own mother would choose her stepdaughter's snobbery over her own daughter and grandchildren, and I keep thinking about all the sacrifices I've made over the years to help them financially and how I've gone without so many things just to make sure they could maintain their fancy lifestyle, and this is how they repay me by telling me I'm not good enough to join them for a holiday meal. Right now I'm sitting here adding up all the money I've sent them over the past 6 years, and it's over $80,000, which could have paid for my kids' college educations or a down payment on a bigger house or a decent car that doesn't need constant repairs, and instead I gave it all to people who think I'm beneath them and not worthy of their precious time and attention unless they need money from me. I know some people might think I'm overreacting or being too dramatic, but I just can't get over the fact that they took my money for years and then turned around and told me I wasn't good enough to eat at their table, and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't hurt or that I should just accept being treated like that because they're family and family is supposed to forgive everything no matter how awful it is. Update 1. I can't believe how fast everything fell apart for them, and I have to admit I'm feeling pretty satisfied with how this all played out, even though I probably shouldn't be enjoying their misery as much as I am right now. So yesterday, after I posted my original story, I spent the rest of the day making Thanksgiving dinner preparations for me and my kids and Mrs. Patterson and Sarah and her daughter Lucy, and I went to the grocery store and bought a small turkey and all the fixings and some nice wine for the adults and sparkling cider for the kids, and I was actually starting to feel excited about having our own little celebration without all the drama and stress that comes with dealing with my mother and Richard and Emma. Around 6 o'clock last night my phone started ringing, and it was my mother, but I didn't answer it because I was helping my kids make construction paper turkeys and handprint place cards for our dinner table, and I didn't want to ruin our good mood by dealing with her drama. She called 3 more times, and then Richard called twice, and then Emma called once, which was surprising because Emma never calls me for anything and usually acts like I don't exist when we're in the same room together. I finally listened to the voicemails around 9 o'clock after my kids went to bed, and my mother was practically hysterical, saying that their heat had stopped working and they couldn't figure out why, and Richard was yelling in the background about how the gas company must have made some kind of mistake, and Emma was crying about how her perfect dinner party was going to be ruined if they couldn't get the heat fixed before tomorrow. Then Richard left this really angry voicemail demanding that I call him back immediately because he knew I had something to do with their utilities being shut off, and he was threatening to drive over to my house and bang on my door until I fixed whatever I had done, and I just deleted the message and turned off my phone because I wasn't going to let them ruin my evening. This morning I woke up feeling more relaxed than I had in months because for the first time in years I didn't have to worry about whether my mother was going to call crying about some financial emergency or whether I was going to have to choose between buying my kids new shoes or sending money to pay for Richard's latest business venture that was definitely going to make them rich this time but somehow never actually did. Around 10 in the morning Mrs. Patterson came over to help me prep the turkey, and she brought homemade cranberry sauce and this amazing stuffing recipe that her grandmother taught her, and we were having such a nice time cooking together and listening to music, and my kids were helping by setting the table and decorating the house with the paper turkeys they made, and it felt like what a real family Thanksgiving should feel like. That's when my phone started ringing again, and this time it was Emma calling, and she was absolutely furious and screaming about how I had sabotaged her dinner party and ruined months of planning, and how dare I take out my petty jealousy on innocent people who had nothing to do with our family drama. She said that their automatic gate wouldn't work because the power was out and that half of her guests couldn't get into the driveway and had to park on the street and walk up to the house, and that the other half just left when they saw what was happening. Emma kept yelling about how the house was freezing cold and they couldn't cook the turkey properly because the gas was shut off and they had to use the outdoor grill, but it was windy and kept going out, and the caterers were threatening to leave because they couldn't use any of the kitchen equipment, and the whole thing was turning into a complete disaster. She said that people were leaving before they even ate anything, and that Richard's business associates were posting about it on social media and laughing about how they got invited to a dinner party in a house with no heat or working appliances. I told Emma that maybe she should have thought about that before she decided I wasn't good enough to attend her fancy dinner party, and that if she wanted to exclude family members from holiday celebrations, then she could deal with the consequences of her actions. And she started screaming about how I was a vindictive psychopath who destroyed people's lives over minor disagreements, and I just hung up on her because I wasn't going to listen to her call me names when she was the one who started this whole mess. Then Richard called, and he was even angrier than Emma, and he was shouting about how I had cost them thousands of dollars in wasted food and embarrassment in front of important people, and how he was going to sue me for damages and make me pay for everything that went wrong with their dinner party. He said that my mother was having some kind of breakdown because she was so humiliated, and that it was all my fault for being so petty and vindictive over something as simple as a guest list for a dinner party. I told Richard that I wasn't paying for their utilities anymore, and that if he wanted heat and electricity then he could get a job and pay for it himself like every other adult in the world, and he started screaming about how I had signed contracts with the utility companies and that I couldn't just cancel services without notice, and I told him that actually I could cancel services whenever I wanted because they were in my name and being paid for with my credit card, and he could figure out how to put them in his own name if he wanted them turned back on. The best part was when my mother finally called around 2 in the afternoon, and she was crying but also really angry, and she said that their beautiful Thanksgiving dinner had turned into a complete nightmare and that people were talking about it all over town, and that Emma was so embarrassed she had locked herself in her room and wouldn't come out, and that Richard was on the phone with lawyers trying to figure out if he could force me to turn their utilities back on. My mother said that they had managed to serve cold turkey sandwiches and store-bought pie to the few guests who stayed, but that most people left early, and that Richard's business contacts were all asking questions about their financial situation and whether they were having money problems, and that the whole thing had made them look poor and desperate in front of people they were trying to impress. She kept asking me why I would do something so cruel and heartless, and I told her that she was the one who chose to uninvite her own daughter and grandchildren from Thanksgiving dinner because we weren't fancy enough for her precious stepdaughter, and that if she wanted to prioritize Emma's social climbing over her own family then she could live with the consequences of that choice. My mother started crying harder and saying that she never meant for any of this to happen and that she was just trying to keep peace in the family and make everyone happy, but I told her that she made her choice when she decided that Emma's opinion was more important than her relationship with me and my kids, and that I wasn't going to keep paying for their lifestyle while they treated us like second-class citizens. Meanwhile, our Thanksgiving dinner turned out absolutely perfect, and Mrs. Patterson and Sarah and Lucy fit right in with our little family, and the kids had such a good time playing games and telling jokes and eating way too much pie, and Sarah brought this amazing green bean casserole that my kids actually ate without complaining, which never happens with vegetables. We played board games after dinner and watched the football game, and it was exactly the kind of warm, relaxed holiday celebration that I wanted my kids to remember, and they kept saying how much fun they were having and how this was the best Thanksgiving ever. I know that my mother and Richard and Emma are probably going to keep calling and demanding that I turn their utilities back on and start sending them money again, but I'm not going to do it because I finally realized that they've been taking advantage of me for years and using my love for my mother to manipulate me into funding their expensive lifestyle while treating me like I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. Update 2. Things have gotten completely insane over the past few days, and I'm starting to understand just how deep their financial problems really go and how much they've been hiding from me while I was sending them money every month like some kind of personal ATM machine. Yesterday morning I was getting ready for work and getting my kids ready for school when someone started pounding on my front door like they were trying to break it down, and when I looked through the peephole I saw Richard standing there looking absolutely furious and disheveled like he hadn't slept in days. I opened the door, and before I could even say anything he pushed past me into my living room and started yelling about how I had ruined everything and that I needed to fix this mess right now before it was too late. Richard was waving around this stack of papers from the bank and shouting about how they had 30 days to come up with $6,700 or they were going to lose the house, and that it was all my fault because I had promised to help them with the mortgage and then pulled the rug out from under them at the last minute. He said that my mother was having panic attacks and couldn't sleep, and that Emma was furious with both of them for getting her involved in this family drama, and that their reputation in the community was completely destroyed because of what happened at Thanksgiving. I told Richard that I never promised anything and that I had been helping them voluntarily out of the goodness of my heart, but that they had made it very clear that my family wasn't good enough for them so they could figure out their own problems from now on. Richard started screaming about how I was being petty and vindictive and that I was punishing my innocent mother for something that wasn't even her fault and that Emma was just a young woman trying to make a good impression on her professional contacts and I had destroyed that for her. Then Richard said something that made me see red and I'm still angry about it days later, and that was when he called my kids street urchins and said that Emma was right to be concerned about having them at a sophisticated dinner party because they obviously hadn't been taught proper manners or social skills, and that maybe this whole situation was a blessing in disguise because now they wouldn't have to pretend to enjoy spending time with people who were clearly beneath their social class. I completely lost it when he said that about my kids, and I started yelling at him about how dare he talk about my children that way when I've been supporting his lazy worthless behind for years while he sits around pretending to be some kind of business mogul when really he's just a con artist who married my mother for her social security income and her life insurance policy from when my dad died. That's when I decided to tell Richard that I knew all about his Tuesday afternoon visits to that apartment complex on the other side of town where his girlfriend Lisa lives and how I'd seen his car there multiple times when I was driving home from my night job, and that I also knew about his gambling problem and how he's been using the money I send to bet on sports games online instead of paying their bills like he told my mother he was doing. Richard's face went completely white when I said that and he started stuttering and trying to deny everything, but I told him that I had been keeping track of their finances more carefully than he thought and that I knew the mortgage payments I had been making weren't going where they were supposed to go and that I had copies of all the bank transfers and receipts and that I would be happy to show them to my mother if he didn't leave my house immediately. I also told Richard that I knew about the $20,000 credit card debt that he had racked up at various casinos and online gambling sites and that I had screenshots of his betting accounts that I had found when I was helping him set up online banking last year, and he had left his laptop open and I saw all the gambling websites in his browser history. Richard started backing toward the door and mumbling about how I was misunderstanding the situation and that he could explain everything, but I told him that he had exactly 60 seconds to get out of my house before I called my mother and told her everything I knew about his secret girlfriend and his gambling addiction and his lies about where the money I had been sending was really going. He practically ran out of my house and I watched through the window as he sat in his car for about 10 minutes making phone calls and looking completely panicked before he finally drove away, and I haven't seen him since then, but I know from my cousin Michelle that he's been calling everyone in the family trying to borrow money and making up different stories about why they need it so urgently. My cousin Michelle called me yesterday and said that Richard had contacted her asking for $5,000 and claiming that they needed it for emergency medical expenses for my mother, but that when Michelle asked to talk to my mother directly to find out what was wrong, Richard got all evasive and said that my mother was too upset to talk on the phone and that he was handling all the arrangements. Then my Aunt Carol called and said that Richard had told her they needed money because their insurance company was refusing to pay for damage from a pipe that burst in their house, but when Carol asked for the insurance paperwork, Richard said he couldn't find it right now but that he would send it later, and then he never called her back when she said she needed to see the documentation before she could help them. My uncle Steve got a call from Emma asking for money and she told him that they were having temporary cash flow problems because of some investments that hadn't paid off yet, but that they would be able to pay him back with interest within 3 months, and when Steve asked her what kind of investments she got all vague and said it was complicated financial stuff that she couldn't really explain over the phone. The funniest part is that my mother finally called me yesterday evening and she was crying and saying that she didn't understand why Richard was being so secretive and weird lately, and that he kept getting phone calls that he would take in another room and that he had been gone for hours at a time without explaining where he was going, and that when she asked him about money he would get angry and tell her not to worry about it because he was handling everything. My mother said that Richard told her I was just being dramatic and vindictive and that the money situation would be resolved soon, but that she was starting to get suspicious because nothing he was saying made sense and because people kept calling the house asking about different stories Richard had told them about why they needed to borrow money. I almost felt sorry for my mother when she was telling me all this because it was obvious that Richard had been lying to her about everything and that she really had no idea how bad their financial situation was or what he had been doing with the money I had been sending them all these years. But then I remembered how she had uninvited me and my kids from Thanksgiving and I hardened my heart again. I told my mother that maybe she should ask Richard some hard questions about where all the money has been going and why they still can't pay their bills after receiving thousands of dollars from me every month for years, and she got quiet for a long time and then said that she was afraid to confront him because she didn't want to make things worse, but that she was starting to realize that maybe she didn't know her husband as well as she thought she did. My mother asked me if I would consider helping them one more time just until they could get back on their feet, and I told her that I wasn't going to send them another penny until she figured out what Richard had really been doing with all the money I had already sent, and that maybe it was time for her to start asking some uncomfortable questions about the man she married and whether he had been honest with her about anything. Final update: I honestly never thought things could fall apart as completely and as quickly as they did, but here we are 3 weeks later and my mother has lost absolutely everything, and I'm not even sorry about it anymore because of what she said to my kids and how she handled this whole situation. About a week after my last update, my cousin Michelle called me and said that Richard had completely disappeared and that my mother had been calling everyone in the family crying and saying that he had packed up all his clothes and personal belongings and left without even leaving a note or telling her where he was going. Michelle said that my mother found out from the neighbors that Richard had been loading boxes into his car for several days while my mother was at her part-time job at the library that she had finally gotten after I stopped sending them money. It turns out that Richard didn't just leave my mother, but he actually moved in with his girlfriend Lisa, who lives in that apartment complex where I had seen his car parked all those times, and apparently he had been planning this for months and using the money I sent to help him get set up with his new life while lying to my mother about everything and telling her that their financial problems were temporary and that everything would work out fine. My mother tried calling Richard's phone, but he had changed his number, and when she drove to Lisa's apartment and banged on the door, Lisa answered and told her that Richard didn't want to see her anymore and that she needed to stop harassing them or Lisa would call the police. And my mother came home crying and finally started going through all of Richard's financial paperwork that he had hidden from her in his home office. That's when my mother discovered that Richard had been gambling away almost every penny I had been sending them, and that he had taken out multiple credit cards in both their names and maxed them all out, and that he had even taken a second mortgage on their house without telling her and used that money to pay gambling debts and support his girlfriend Lisa, who apparently has 3 kids from previous relationships and needed money for rent and car payments and other expenses. The house was already in foreclosure proceedings like Richard had said, but it wasn't because they needed $6,700 to catch up on payments, but because they owed over $30,000 in back payments and fees and penalties, and the bank had already scheduled the auction for the end of December, and there was no way to stop it even if they could come up with the money, which they couldn't because Richard had cleaned out their joint savings account before he left. My mother also found out that Richard had been lying about his business and his investments, and that he actually hadn't worked in over 2 years and had been spending his days at the casino and the racetrack and online gambling sites, and that everything he had told her about business meetings and potential deals was complete fiction, and that the only income they had was my monthly payments and my mother's small salary from her library job. Emma completely turned on my mother when she found out about all this and told her that she was embarrassed to be associated with her and that she never wanted to see her again, and that she was going to tell everyone that Richard wasn't her real father anyway, so nobody would connect her to this scandal, and that my mother was a fool who should have known better than to trust a man like Richard, who was obviously a loser and a con artist. Emma also blamed my mother for ruining her reputation in the community and said that people were still talking about the Thanksgiving disaster and making jokes about how Emma's family couldn't even pay their electric bill, and that it was going to take years for Emma to rebuild her social status, and that she wasn't going to let my mother drag her down any further with her poor choices in men. The bank auction happened last week, and my mother had to be out of the house by Friday, and she had nowhere to go because she couldn't afford an apartment on her library salary, and she had no savings and no credit because Richard had destroyed her credit score with all the debt he had accumulated in her name, and no family members were willing to let her move in with them because everyone was angry about Richard trying to scam them for money. My mother called me Thursday night crying and begging me to let her come stay with me and my kids just temporarily until she could figure out what to do, and she said she would sleep on the couch and wouldn't be any trouble, and that she finally understood how wrong she had been to treat me the way she did, and that she was sorry for letting Emma convince her to uninvite us from Thanksgiving. I told my mother that I would think about it overnight and call her back in the morning because I wanted to talk to my kids about it first and see how they felt about having their grandmother move in with us even temporarily, and also because I needed time to process everything that had happened and decide whether I was ready to forgive her for choosing Emma and Richard over me and my children. Friday morning my mother showed up at my door carrying 2 suitcases and crying and saying that she had no place else to go, and that the moving truck was coming to take her furniture to storage, and that she was desperate and needed help, and that she would do anything to make up for how she had treated me, and that she realized now that I was the only real family she had left. I was about to invite her in when my 8-year-old son came running to the door because he heard voices, and he was excited to see his grandmother, and he said, "Grandma, Grandma, you're here," and started to hug her, but my mother pushed him away and said, "Not now, sweetie. Grandma is having a very serious conversation with your mommy," and my son looked hurt and confused and asked if he had done something wrong. That's when my mother said something that made me realize she hadn't really changed at all, and that she still thought she was better than us even though she had just lost everything and had nowhere else to go. And what she said was that she hoped my kids would learn some proper manners now that they were going to be living with their grandmother, because they obviously needed guidance about how to behave around adults and how to show respect for their elders. Then my mother looked at my kids, who were both standing there listening, and said that she had always been concerned about how they were being raised, and that maybe this situation would be a blessing in disguise because she could teach them how to act like proper young ladies and gentlemen instead of running around like little street urchins with no sense of decorum or social graces. When I heard my mother call my children street urchins, which was exactly what Richard had called them, I just saw red, and I told her that she had not changed one bit, and that she was still the same judgmental snob who thought she was better than everyone else even when she was homeless and begging for help, and I told her to get off my property immediately and never come back. My mother started crying and saying that she didn't mean it the way it sounded and that she was just upset and not thinking clearly, but I told her that she had shown me exactly who she really was, and that I didn't want someone like that around my children, who were perfect just the way they were and didn't need to be criticized and judged by someone who had made such terrible choices in her own life. I shut the door in my mother's face and watched through the window as she stood there crying for about 10 minutes before she finally picked up her suitcases and walked away, and I haven't heard from her since then, and I don't want to hear from her because I'm done with people who think they can treat my kids badly and then expect forgiveness when their own lives fall apart. My kids asked me why Grandma was crying and why she couldn't come in, and I told them that sometimes adults say mean things when they're upset and that Grandma needed to learn how to be kind to people before she could be part of our family again, and my 10-year-old daughter said that she didn't like how Grandma talked to them anyway and that she was glad we had our own Thanksgiving without all the drama. I found out from my cousin Michelle that my mother is staying at a women's shelter downtown and that she's trying to find a full-time job and a cheap apartment, but that it's been really hard because of her age and her destroyed credit, and that she keeps asking family members if they've heard from me and whether I might change my mind about letting her stay with us. Michelle asked me if I felt bad about turning my mother away when she had nowhere else to go, and I told her that I felt bad for my mother's situation, but that I wasn't going to let someone who called my children street urchins live in my house and influence them with her toxic attitude, and that my kids deserved better than having a grandmother who looked down on them and made them feel bad about themselves. I've been sleeping better than I have in years, knowing that I don't have to worry about my mother calling with some financial emergency, or Richard showing up at my door demanding money, or Emma treating my kids like they're not good enough to breathe the same air as her, and I've been able to save more money in the past 3 weeks than I saved in the previous 6 months when I was sending them thousands of dollars every month. My kids are happier too because they're not constantly hearing me stress about money or watching me skip meals, so I can send their grandmother money, and they've been getting little treats and new clothes, and we're planning a real Christmas celebration this year with actual presents under the tree instead of me having to choose between gifts for my kids and bailing my mother out of whatever mess Richard had gotten them into that month. I know some people might think I'm heartless for turning away my homeless mother, but she made her choices when she decided that Emma's opinion was more important than her relationship with me and my kids, and when she stood by while Richard insulted my children, and when she called them street urchins even when she was desperate and begging for help, and I'm not going to reward that kind of behavior by rescuing her from the consequences of her own actions.